Hello and welcome to yet another one of the Cincinnati Heart Failure Lecture Series. My name is Mahir Poryahi and I'll be discussing physiology pressure volume loops. As a part of understanding an overall cardiac physiology, we start out by discussing a Wiggers diagram. I'm sure many of you are aware of this diagram. It is a diagram that divides the cardiac cycle throughout its stages. What does that entail? It divides the atrial, ventricular, and aortic pressures as it correlates with the volume loop within the EKG and the associated auscultation findings. Otto Frank found using isolated frog hearts that strength of ventricular contraction was increased when the ventricle was stretched prior to the contraction. Around similar time, Dr. Sterling and colleagues in the early 20th century found that increasing venous return to the heart led to an increased left ventricular end diastolic pressure, which correlated to a stroke volume. So what does that help translate to? It correlates to the ability of the heart to change its force of contraction and therefore stroke volume in response to change in venous return. This is coined as the Frank-Starling mechanism. Utilizing the Frank-Starling mechanism, we can further describe a pressure volume loop, which is an essential part of cardiac physiology that can actually help better explain some of the pathophysiology we see within heart failure. On simple formulas on the bottom left, you have stroke volume, which is end systolic volume minus end diastolic volume. Ejection fraction, which is stroke volume divided by end diastolic volume. And cardiac output, which is stroke volume times the heart rate. I'm sure many of you are familiar with those formulas. Now, looking at the graph, you see on the y-axis you have pressure, and on the x-axis you have volume. Left ventricular pressure is plotted against the LV volume at multiple time points during a single cycle. What is a cardiac cycle? It's divided into 4 phases: ventricular filling, isovolumetric contraction, ejection, and isovolumetric relaxation. What does the width of the loop entail? It gives us an idea of the overall stroke volume. What is ESPVR? It represents the inotropic state of the ventricle. It's the end systolic pressure volume relationship. Going through the cycle, let me walk you through some of the stages. So, standing here where the red point is showing, you have diastolic filling within the left ventricle. As you can see, from end systolic volume to end diastolic volume, the volume increases. We start isovolumetric contraction. As the name suggests, the volume stays consistent while the pressure increases. You hit the diastolic pressure. The aortic valve is now open. You have systolic ejection. The aortic valve closes. You start going through the isovolumetric relaxation. Once again, as the name suggests, the volume stays consistent while the pressure drops. And we go back to where we were, where you start having the diastolic filling phase of our cardiac cycle. So looking at the different pressure volume loops, taking the gray color to be control, what's the difference between green and red? Now there's a hint already on the page, which is the green displays a decreased preload. What does that mean? That means the end systolic volume is around the same place. However, the end diastolic volume, due to a reduction in preload, is reduced. This is affecting our stroke volume, as can be compared with control. Now, similarly, on the red, there's an increase in preload, and as you can see, once again, your end systolic volume is the same. However, your end diastolic volume is increased as compared to your control. Now, within the next graph, as you can see, we're staying within the same ESPVR. The green, as the hint is already there is a decrease in afterload. What does that mean? You start ejecting earlier, and you don't have to reach those higher pressure to eject. And so you have a loop that goes all the way to your aortic valve closure and then the isovolumetric relaxation. So in this case, your area, what are the parameters that are changed? Your end diastolic volume is similar amongst all groups, whether it's increase or decrease in afterload. However, your end systolic volume is different because your ejection time and your overall ejection percentage has increased. And so with decreased afterload, it has increased. And so that's why you have that decrease in end systolic volume in a decreased afterload, as compared to the red graph, which demonstrates an increase in afterload as compared to control and a smaller stroke volume. You can also see that the pressures at which you have the ejection phase is much higher in the red as compared to the control, which is gray, as compared to the green, which is a decrease in afterload. Finally, you see a stage where your ESPVR have a different slope. This is representative of different inotropic state, where the green has a reduced slope and a decreased inotropy, and a red has a increased slope and so increase in inotropy. So as can be seen in here, you have a demonstration of a change in end systolic pressure volume relationship with a decrease in inotropy on the left as compared to a gray normal. On the right, there's a difference in point A to B, which, as you know, is comparing stroke volume to left ventricular and diastolic pressure as seen on Frank-Starling curve. In this graph, however, what has changed? Your ESPVR is still the same graph. You do have, as compared to your gray, a slight decrease in your end systolic volume. However, the left ventricular and diastolic volume is significantly compromised, with a decrease in stroke volume. So which disease state would be represented by this graph? If you guessed diastolic dysfunction or heart failure with preserved ejection fraction, you're correct. Let's start here. So this is a normal pressure volume loop looking at a left ventricle. On the left, you have the pressure, and on the x-axis, you have the volume. Let's start talking about how do different things affect this loop. We have a decrease within the red as compared to control in ESPVR. What is this signifying? A heart failure with reduced EF, some decrease in inotropy, and a significant increase in end systolic volume. Also in this state, there's not overtly a significant difference in your overall pressure. What happens if we reduce afterload? Now, the red graph with a clear inside versus the red graph with a reddish tinge shows you that difference. Why do we emphasize an afterload reduction, whether that's with ACE, ARB, ARNI? As you can see in this graph, a decrease in afterload leads to a reduction in end systolic volume and overall greater stroke volume with a reduction in pressure and more of an ejection time. Would that difference be so exaggerated in a normal heart? Not exactly. This is why in heart failure patients, an afterload reduction or optimizing the peripheral vascular resistance can have a much more exaggerated improvement in symptoms and response than a controlled subject without heart failure and reduced ejection fraction. You can see a difference within the stroke volume demonstrated by the width of each loop. As can be seen here, PVA is directly proportional to myocardial oxygen demand. Normal pressure volume loop is bounded by end systolic pressure volume relationship, or ESPVR, and end diastolic pressure volume relationship, EDPVR. ESPVR is proximately linear with a slope and end systolic elastance, and volume access intercepts at VO. Effective arterial elastance, EA, is the slope of the line extending from end diastolic volume point on the volume axis through the end systolic pressure volume point of the loop. In B, slope of EA line depends on total peripheral resistance and heart rate, and its position depends on end diastolic volume. Thank you for joining us yet again in another Cincinnati Heart Failure lecture series.